75 years ago, Japan announced its decision to surrender its armies in East Asia to the United States and the Soviet Union unconditionally, and to open up negotiations that would lead to a formal treaty of surrender signed on September 2nd, 1945, on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. It was the end of a terrible war, and many in the region hoped that some greater order of peace could be established rapidly, one that would fulfill the fervent desires and dreams of those who had battled against imperialism and fascism for so long in every country, including within Japan. But those rays of hope for a new day were mingled with memories of the rising sun of the Japanese Imperial Army's flag. Much of that negative spirit of militarism was never fully dismantled, but rather redirected towards industrialization, and the worst of that specter simply burrowed away in the Japanese system of things. And those rays of hope overlapped with the bright flash of the atomic bombs the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those rays of radiation that revealed the deep force, dark force, lurking beneath the surface in the powerful nation which had overwhelmed the Japanese. Those nuclear weapons are still with us today, even now, invisible but more powerful, ready to turn the entire earth into an inferno at any moment. The United Nations then, in 1945, was established. The doors were open for a new and more open society in which all of humanity would receive the respect it deserved, and even within the United States military, there were those who pushed for something greater, who asked more of themselves in 1945. For all the poverty and the fear of starvation that hovered over the heads of millions here in East Asia after the collapse of the Japanese Empire, there was also a palpable hope for the future as well. But the modern history of Northeast Asia would follow a narrow, winding path, a craggy outcrop of rock above, and the perilous cliff down to the unforgiving sea below. The United States, still inspired by much of the internationalist, anti-fascist ideas of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace, made efforts still to pursue a better future for the region, including incentives for real democracy and for land reform. But on Wall Street, American financiers and old money with cozy ties to London, men who dreamed of picking up the tattered armor of the British Empire for themselves, they had other plans. Slowly but deliberately, they pushed out the anti-fascists and the New Dealers in Washington, D.C., and launched into a brutal anti-communist campaign that altered the debate on foreign policy for the next 75 years, to this day. That shift took a turn for the worse in 1949, when the battle in Washington, D.C. over the status of the new People's Republic of China was lost, and a consensus was formed in opposition to recognizing this political reality. The American experts who suggested that the United States should continue to support the People's Republic of China, or at the minimum, recognize it as a nation, were drowned out by vindictive calls of who lost China. Any American who suggested that communism was not the most important issue were promptly driven from the room. The future of East Asia in 1945 was bound to the future of Korea. That had been the case in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and at the time of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 as well. And it is the case today. Korea has the cultural sophistication, the institutional complexity, and the geopolitical incentive to push for an integrated and cooperative Northeast Asia. It was true then, and it's true now. The thoughtful intellectual Kim Gu led the efforts to create a unified Korea and to lay the foundations for an integrated and peaceful Northeast Asia back in 1945, right here in Seoul. Kim Gu started out as a scion of an established family who hoped to pass the civil service examinations and to serve with distinction in government. But he would ultimately witness his country torn apart by foreign powers, and he was compelled to take a stand against imperialism and eventually was forced to move his activities to Shanghai, where he served as president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea. He was preparing to take Korea back at the time that he learned of the dropping of the atomic bombs in 1945. Kim Gu saw education and culture above all as the ultimate means to transform Korea and with it transform East Asia and to bring true happiness to the people. He wrote at the time, "I want this nation to be the most beautiful nation, but that does not mean it must be the most powerful nation." That simple line of Kim Gu suggests why Korea, with its commitment to philosophical and cultural solutions, has the greatest potential to lead in a manner not found in other nations. Kim Gu also saw independence and a new peace regime in Northeast Asia as something that all citizens must be a part of. Although he started out as an elitist, after suffering torture and oppression, time in prison opened his eyes to the sufferings of ordinary people. While in prison, he started to teach his fellow prisoners and made the prison itself into a school. When we think about how our world is being made into an enormous prison today, we can derive inspiration from Kim Gu about what we can do, and this is all the more true for all intellectuals today. Kim Gu was assassinated in 1949, the critical year in which tolerance for Pan-Asians, for dialogue with communists and socialists collapsed. The simplistic demonization of communism altered the debate in Asia, replacing the critical anti-fascist alliances of the 1930s and the 1940s with a new and ultimately ambiguous anti-communist alliance system. Legitimate critiques of communist policies in Washington, D.C. were skillfully mixed together with devious plans to make America a global player like the British Empire had been. The position was ultimately a poisonous one, but the poison extracted from the envy of British hegemony was a slow-acting poison that only took its full effect 75 years later. Many well-informed Americans picked up the mandate for American leadership unaware of what was implied, just as Frodo Baggins in The Lord of the Rings could not fathom the significance of the ring he had been given, so also Americans did not know exactly what this alliance system implied. Americans made tremendous contributions in Asia, in scholarship, in the selfless efforts in the Peace Corps, and in science. In retrospect, those contributions were unfailingly diluted or tinged with other agendas that were not so benign. The balance, however, was still positive in Asia until recently. There is one thing I will never be able to change about myself, and that is my status as an American and as an American who has benefited from the best of America's institutions. I was trained in Chinese language and literature at Yale College as an undergraduate, graduated in 1987, and I received a PhD in Harvard University from the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. And I taught Asian Studies at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the home of Adlai Stevenson, and at George Washington University for 10 years. I met a central scholar of Asian Studies and prominent diplomat Edwin Rischauer at the Inter-University Center for Japanese Studies in Yokohama, Japan, right after I arrived there in 1987. At the time, I thought of his life as something of a model for how I could make a contribution. I did not know at that time that I would myself deliver talks at the Harvard Yenching Institute 15 years later, and that I would play a role in diplomacy and security much later. I also did not know that the entire American diplomatic and security system would completely lose direction later, and that the most negative aspects of the American system would overwhelm those positive. I believed in the positive role that America could play, and I was one of a small group of American scholars who were deeply committed to the accurate understanding of Asia. We argued for more funding for Asian studies, we tried to inform average Americans about Asia, and we tried to promote constructive policies in Washington, D.C., even as a violently racist and anti-Asian mood started to spread. Our group was losing influence in the United States from the late 1990s on. We wanted Americans to be more deeply engaged in Asia, in education, in science, and in direct exchanges between citizens. But the trend was in the opposite direction. Intellectuals in general were being marginalized in American society, especially experts on Asia. You see, intellectuals ceased to play a vital role in academics and government at exactly that time. In their place, corporations pushing for free trade agreements, weapons systems, missile defense, and currency swaps replaced the thoughtful, if occasionally compromised intellectuals in universities and in government who had made things work before. The consultants and lobbyists who run international relations for profit have seized the reins. The disaster that resulted has reached a peak under the Trump administration, although we cannot lay the blame at the feet of President Donald Trump himself. But the wave itself goes back in time, and its origins can be traced back beyond the 1990s, back to the end of the Cold War, and even to the compromises made 75 years ago in 1945. I spent 3 years in Washington, D.C., and on 2 occasions working with major think tanks, with the Asia Institute, and observing up close the efforts to push an agenda in international relations that had nothing to do with security or with prosperity, but that was marketed by public relations firms in every possible way to try and make it look positive. A jungle of security consulting firms driven by the endless search for profits replaced government officials and academics with a sense of responsibility, those who I knew starting back in 2000. Of course, the United States is not the only player in Northeast Asia today, but other nations are oddly unable to muster the vision, the tenacity, and the long-term planning necessary to create a Northeast Asian peace regime today, one that rises above the national interests of any one country. It is certainly not my opinion that the United States must play the central role in the prosperous development, the ethical governance, or the secure peace of Northeast Asia. If the United States cannot clearly demonstrate in a scientific and logical manner that it has a positive role to play here, then it has no role to play. I do want to suggest that Northeast Asia brings together tremendous assets in terms of the profound teachings of Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and other native traditions, in terms of scholarship and a culture of learning and ethics, in terms of economic and technological influence around the world, which is founded on moral philosophy. But we must first recognize the crisis that we face today and address that crisis directly. We must first address the collapse of biodiversity and prepare for the mitigation of climate change and the adaptation to its consequences at every level in society. Most of us still have our eyes tight shut. We must turn the best of Asia's culture. We can turn to the best of Asia's culture for inspiration about how to live a spiritually full life without needless consumption, and how to restore the technologies of organic farming and stable communities that made Northeast Asia so stable for millennia. The Chinese scholar Lin Yutang wrote in his book Between Tears and Laughter, published in London in 1945, about the dangers latent in the post-war order dominated by global powers and by global finance. He denounced the racist and imperialist assumptions flowing from London and infecting Washington, D.C. like a deadly virus. When Lin Yutang wrote about the crisis then, what he wrote then resonates at every level with the current situation in Northeast Asia. He wrote, "The purpose of this book is to say something that must be said and to say it with simplicity. The age calls for simple statements and restatements of simple truths. The prophets of doom are involved. Those who would bring light must be clear. Our problem is the problem of moral decay and regeneration. From a handful of dust, faith must come. There is more hope in a heather rose than there is in all the tons of Teutonic philosophy. I do not know how to say these things, but God give me the strength to say them. The shadow of another war already looms before us. We have to think straight and think fast." And so, here we are, 75 years later, on the 75th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War. We are facing a similar crisis, and perhaps hidden within that crisis are a few opportunities. That crisis demands that we change not merely a particular policy or habit, but rather how we perceive the world. The crisis demands that we see things as they are. The COVID-19 crisis represents that problem directly. Now, that is one hell of a virus. It is a virus for sure, a lethal and highly contagious virus that is killing millions. What is unique about this virus, however, is what makes it so difficult to treat. The problem is that its DNA bonds with the human spirit, and its RNA digs deep its roots into the human intellect. The virus uses its ruthless mandibles to pry open the human soul so as to inject its deadly larvae deep inside, far behind the eyes, where they devour us from within. The post-COVID-19 world will be one in which we, here in Asia, have taken back control of our minds and of our souls. One in which we can, as citizens, imagine a future for all of us and create that future with our own hands. It will be a world in which we can realize the full potential that was left behind tragically in 1945.